Well, welcome back, everyone, to this conference on digital immortality and mortality, philosophy, ethics, and design. We had one panel already on law and ethics. If you missed it, it's been recorded and will be available for viewing on Catch Up. It was great. It was very interesting. Indeed, I really enjoyed it. Lots of new perspectives. Of course, it's such a new area of research. There were some really interesting suggestions and many questions. And also lots of interesting connections to this panel on the philosophy of digital mortality and immortality. And again, we have a very esteemed panel of three figures who really are the leaders in the field. Thank you very much to all three of you for joining us. We have Maggi Savin-Baden, who's a professor of higher education research at the University of Worcester and author of a number of books on this topic. We've got Patrick Stokes, who's associate professor of philosophy at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. Patrick, are you joining us from Australia right now? Because
yes, I am.
It must be a most ungodly hour. Thank you very much.
It's just gone midnight, so I'm looking forward to the next time someone asks me what philosophers actually do, and I can say we talk about death at midnight, which sounds kind of impressive.
Cool. Excellent. Well, yes, I know when Kasia was trying to put together this panel and all of the day's events, she was trying to make sense of the different time zones, and I think eventually we just gave up. I guess if you're an academic in Australia, you have to put up with that to an extent. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us. And we have Davide Sisto, a philosopher and researcher in theoretical philosophy at the University of Turin. So we will do the same as the last panel. Each speaker will speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will have discussion afterwards. We have an hour and a half for the session. Participants, please do put your questions in the Q&A at any time. You don't have to wait for the discussion section. You can put them in during the talks, and then I'll be reading from them once everyone has finished. So very good. Without any further ado, I will hand over to Maggi. Maggi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope my slideshare goes all right, because the last one I did, it went a bit wobbly. So forgive me if I make a mess of it to start with. Are we good?
We are good.
Is it working? Yes?
Yep, looking good, Maggi.
Yeah, right, thank you. Okay, so yeah, I'm fairly new to this field. I've really only been working in it about, I don't know, since 2017 with my co-author David Burden, when we started looking at something we then called digital immortality. And I've since moved into a different place from that. So I'm also in with a group of philosophers, and I'm clearly not a philosopher. I'm very much a higher education researcher. So I'm sure anything philosophical, the others will pick up on, sort out for me later. So thank you in advance. So I think digital immortality, a bit like Cole said earlier, implies an everlasting presence, which I think is quite problematic. I think perspectives in the 2000s tended to focus on robotics and memorialization and the creation and maintenance of digital beings. Whereas in the 70s, it was much more on the symbolic nature of immortality, which I think is much more philosophical. So my shift came really through writing with a lawyer and with David Burden about the idea of digital immortality in 2017, and the realization that what we began to realize we thought we were actually talking about was about more like digital afterlife, which is about the continuation of an active or passive presence after death. And we know that digital immortality continues to be used, but our interest is more in digital afterlife, because we think that afterlife does assume a digital presence, and it's not something, as again, as Carl said, it's not ad infinitum. And this for me raises all sorts of interesting questions in terms of religion, which I'll come on to later. I did a small scale study and interviewed 16 people from different religious faiths. They were fairly in-depth interviews with follow-up discussions online. This occurred just before and then during the pandemic. And what I wanted to find out was what were people's perspectives on digital afterlife. What did they really think happened? And a lot of them talked about it being created default through social media, which brought with it this kind of a sense of it being trivialized. I also asked a lot of people if they would create a digital immortal, a copy of themselves. And I know Davide Sisto is in the discussion with us today, and his company helped create a digital copy of me one summer, just to see how it would be. And I tried it out with some of my triathlon friends to see what they thought about this digital copy of me. So just seeing what could be done in 3 weeks, that's how quickly they turned it around. But there's definitely a discomfort about that. But there was also a sense of a feeling of detachment, that the creation by default was separate from the spiritual realm and the idea of where the soul would be located physically after death. And I touch on some of that in my new book on digital afterlife and the spiritual realm, which is coming out in a few weeks' time. So the key issues really, I think, that came out of the study were about absent presence, Sontag's notion of time's relentless melt, issues about semiotics and symbols, the digital death pragmeme, and philosophy and theology. So they're the kind of 5 things that I'm going to talk about now. Obviously, many of you know here will know the idea of absent presence from the work of Derrida. And in many ways, if you look back to the past, it originally referred to the idea of the absence of the author in the circulated text. For those of us in the UK, Dickens would be a classic example of that work. Or again, even if you have a faith and you've used the Bible, Paul's letters would also have been circulated text to different groups within Galatia and Corinthia. And what we see today is that absent presence is a feature of all mediated communication, where people are separated from one another by time and space, as indeed we are today. And this is just an example that I've put together. I'm not particularly going to go through all this because of the time constraints. But if we look, you can think about present presence, speaking to somebody who's dead on the phone as if they were still there. Present absence, messaging the dead on Facebook, which a lot of people do. Absent presence, someone you're with, classically in a restaurant, who's communicating with someone else where, or in terms of the death, speaking to the post-death avatar of your loved one, or absent absence, using spaces of digital remembrance to recognize absence, such as virtual graveyards and cemeteries. The other thing that I think is really interesting that came out of this study was that this is obviously a photograph of me and my ski holiday, but all photographs are memento mori. It's participating in another person's things, mortality, vulnerability, mutability. This is what Sontag argued back in 1990. And it's this idea that photographs testify to time's relentless melt. And I think this is a really useful image when we're talking about digital immortality and digital afterlife. I wonder, though, in the digital age, whether it's less of a melt, but relentless remains. And the consequences that we have accommodations around death and bereavement that have changed, resulting in something that I refer to as the digital death pragmeme. These conventions, the kind of known conventions about what one is supposed to do around the graveyard, although, you know, I think it's Sophie Facilities that talks about the interruption of the graveyard space with cameras. But the prag means a situated speech act, which is not dependent upon the words, but on the context and the culture in which it is situated. And I think what we've seen with the digital is the shift, particularly when you see either online funerals or recorded funerals or cameras at funerals or selfies at funerals. And so what we're seeing is the kind of the digital space is being used to mimic real life spaces. But in terms of language and practice and rituals, this is failing quite often and causing upset and difficulty. So what you see is that people are breaking away from this prag meme of accommodation and instead speak directly to the dead, using a linguistic style to suggest affection and close relationship, even if this is not the case. And you see this in celebrity mourning. And I think what's needed for online death space is a deeper awareness of the digital prag meme. That death and dying in digital spaces should be guided by both the context and the culture in which it's occurring, and there needs to be a lot more sensitivity around that. The other thing that I've been looking at too is the semiotics and symbols, which are kind of many ways are familiar. They are prag memes of accommodation. And in the past, we've seen ghosts as warnings, Hamlet, Marley's ghost, or narrating angels in things like the novel The Lovely Bones. You also see skulls, reminder of death and mortality. Alas, poor Yorick, back to Hamlet again. But also we're seeing now the commodification of skulls in fashion, which is kind of seen as cool and all right. But I think for many people, it feels a strange practice, sort of disturbing. But the big one for me is really the angels. When you look at religion, angels are seen as celestial beings or messengers. But what you often see in social media is the angel as being recreated in digital form, people speaking to their loved ones with the assumption that they have become angels in digital spaces. And again, I haven't done research in depth in this, but I think it's a really interesting area of study. I think the other thing is that I'm also co-editing a book on post-digital theologies and working a lot of theologians. And what we're also seeing is the transposition of the sacramental. So the sacred is moving into the digital, or perhaps more accurately, it's a migration. Because transposition suggests something's deliberate, but actually I think it's not deliberate here. It's almost happening behind our back as a result of both cultural and digital change. And it's almost happening without people noticing that it's happening. And there were some questions earlier about religious beliefs and digital afterlife. And this table is in the book, and it's based on the interviews that I did. And I asked people about their afterlife beliefs across these different religions. And what you actually saw was particular people's personal stance towards the digital afterlife. And it was much more varied. A lot of people were really puzzled about it. Hindus thought it might upset karma in the future. But also even people who were humanist were a bit confused about, even if there wasn't going to be an afterlife, what was going to happen to the digital stuff. But then there were people like Sikhs and to some extent Christians who were more comfortable with it, as long as it was a reflection rather than an idealized copy. So, I mean, again, some very interesting perspectives on religion and afterlife. And just to finish, really, I just wanted to say that I quite like the imagery of the final cut. The final cut's the idea that we tidy up our life on social media either before we die, or it's tidied up for us by other people before we're presented in a digital space. But at the same time, you see social media is both an interruption and an interruption of funeral practices and ways of mourning, as well as about views of death and the afterlife. So that's me. I'm just going to leave you with my final slide. Oops, I was. Oh. Which says, who has a question?
Well, thank you, Maggie, for that wonderful overview of the many different aspects of digital immortality and how it touches upon existing philosophical and religious beliefs. And so those were surprising to me, and in the light of what Carl was saying in the last panel, surprisingly coherent responses from those different religious viewpoints. We will save questions till later, but I'd be curious to hear a bit more about how you elicited such coherent responses, what your how many people you spoke to, and whether, say, all the Christians you spoke to really were agreed on the meaning of digital immortality. But we will come back to that. I think first we will press on and hear from Patrick. Patrick, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I will attempt to share my screen, which is always hilariously awkward for some reason, even this deep into living on Zoom as we all have been. Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. My talk today, or tonight as it is here, or this morning actually, hello from tomorrow. The talk is basically summarizing some things from my recent book, Digital Souls, trying to come at some questions that are raised within philosophy of death and also philosophy of personal identity by some of the technologies we've been discussing so far in this event. Adina has already sort of said that, and others have indicated as well too, that a lot of the existing sort of legislative and legal responses, but also a lot of the commercial responses, and even many of the social responses to some of these emerging technologies, and also to the phenomena of people leaving online traces after they die, have tended to see our digital remains or the digital assets that we leave behind when we die through the lens of existing assumptions about property rights and privacy rights. They've tended to see them as inheritable property that, and any rights of use or reuse or preservation or destruction that go with them are seen through that particular lens. The reason that I think, and this kind of echoes some of what Adina was saying too, I think that ultimately is not sufficient because it doesn't fully grapple with what these actually are for us, the role they actually play in our ethically freighted life world, the way in which these assets play a role in part of an ongoing ethical project of preserving the dead and keeping the dead with us in the life world as objects of loving regard. And so there's a set of important ethical questions, and upstream of those, there's a set of important philosophical questions, both ontological ones and phenomenological ones, which I think are increasingly unavoidable. That is, we need to consider whether digital assets are in fact best thought of as forms of property or not, or as something else, or whether something more like Fleury's account of constitutive data or the digital, the informational body might in fact be a better way of thinking of them. But also, crucially, whether any of these technologies can actually count as forms of survival of the person in ways that activate ethical regard. Now, that's a bit of a problem for philosophers of death, because pretty much since Epicurus, most philosophers of death, though not all, have bought into some version of what Fred Feldman called the termination thesis. That is the thesis that at death, the person ceases to exist, or at least ceases to exist qua person. So it might continue to exist as a corpse, but a corpse is not, on that view, a person. Feldman himself doesn't share that view. That kicks off an enormous discussion that is still what a huge amount of philosophy of death still circles around, basically. Well, if we cease to exist at death, how is it the case that we can have duties to the dead? How can we harm or benefit the dead, and so forth? I think a lot of those debates are kind of relevant here, but there's also a really important phenomenology of how we live with the dead, the way in which the dead present themselves to us as both persistent and radically absent at the same time. All of those, I think, come together in asking, what are the prospects for digital immortality? That is, in which ways is it possible to survive, and what kinds of survival are made possible by these affordances? And that's going to be different, I think, for different kinds of, different categories of digital remain or putative digital immortality. So the question that we face is, what are the prospects for digital immortality for digital remains? So just the things that we just by default leave behind when we die. The prospects for survival of biological death through something like reanimation of those digital remains through chatbots and the like, and through transhumanist claims of mind upload. What kind of forms of survival are made possible by that? Now, a lot of these things, as we'll see, are actually kind of continuous with each other, but I think they do activate different concerns about survival and non-survival. So digital remains, the way in which obviously has now become quite well studied, the way in which we continue to interact with the things that people leave behind when they die. It is simply a case now that for much of us, we are present to each other through much of our lives, through mediated environments like this one, and things like social network services, for instance, have become, just in relatively recent history, a very key part of how we live with each other, how we communicate, and how we are phenomenally present with each other, the way in which our face is present with the other in a fairly sort of, loaded sense of the term face, a kind of Levinasian sense of that term. And we know that when people die, the nature of those online platforms means that there is a strong sense of continuity, because they kind of look pretty much the same after the person has died as they did before. They're just less responsive. That creates a sense of ongoing continuity and presence, which, as Elaine Casket has told us, some people find creepy and upsetting, but other people find really comforting and really horrified by the idea that those resources or those assets or digital presences might disappear. Now, I've argued elsewhere, I'm not going to go into too much, so I think this actually does generate a prima facie duty not to delete the dead, and this links in with some of what Carl was saying in the previous session. Part of that is grounded in the idea that as persons, we have a number of substantial realizers. Philosophers of personal identity tend to get into this very unproductive game of trying to pin down which are the identity and persistence conditions of persons, which are the one set of things. Is it going to be bodily? Is it going to be your brain? Is it going to be your brain stem in some versions? Is it going to be animal life? Is it going to be psychological continuity over time, a soul? I think it's a very unproductive game. I think it's better to think of a person as a cluster concept. That is, it's a bunch of stuff that tends to go together, and they have different substantial realizers. The bodies, where we exist in the minds of others. We exist in physical objects that form part of our identity, like writing. And I think we also exist in social media artifacts. So I'm drawing here on particularly people like Richard Hirschmink and others who argue that just as we're increasingly thinking of mind as something that's extended, not just something that happens in your skull, but a thing that extends into your environment, so we should be thinking of persons as things that are kind of extended into the world, or personal identity as a thing that is extended into the world. And you can see where something like Floridi's informational identity model fits really well with that kind of approach. And that means that digital remains can't just be thought of as information about the dead, or presentations of the dead, as we might think of social media, for instance, but as something that it genuinely is strongly analogous to their physical remains, to their bodies. I come back to this example again and again. Ray Gator gives the example that he says, that nicely sums up the paradoxical nature of this stuff. When Charlie Chaplin, about a month after he died in, I think it was 1974, his body was dug up by a gang of criminals who wanted to ransom it off. And Gator says, when we hear that, we cannot help but think, what a horrible thing to do to Charlie Chaplin. How could you treat Charlie Chaplin like that? Even though in the very next breath, we might think, of course, at that time, Charlie Chaplin is no more. And that speaks to this ambiguity of presence and absence that kind of suffuses corpses and gives them part of what Robert Pogue Harrison called the charisma of the corpse, or remnant thinghood, as he rather nicely sums it up. So I think that with digital remains, we need to be treating that as not simply a metaphor, right? It may be less than fully literal, but it's more than merely metaphorical. That is, they are actually something more analogous to physical remains or to corpses than they are to just bits of information. And that then means that just a property approach to disposing of them or managing them isn't necessarily going to cut it. Why? Well, when your great aunt dies, you might inherit her house and you might inherit her pet parakeet, but you do not inherit her corpse. You don't own that corpse. What you have is a duty and a right of disposal or preservation of that corpse. So we need to be thinking, I think, here less in terms of ownership of these assets and more, as Jed Brubaker and others have put it, in terms of stewardship of those remains. So that's a kind of survival, but it's a very thin kind of survival. But nonetheless, I think there is a kind of survival here whereby these digital remains allow the dead to persist in the life world and probably do enhance our capacity to survive in that thin sense, better than corpses do, because corpses obviously break down and so on, and also better than just pure organic memory on its own can do, because it too is notoriously fallible and subject to the fact that, the people who remember you will also die. So I think there is a story there about a genuine kind of survival, but a relatively thin one. So what then about reanimation? Now, this scenario I think is pretty well trafficked. My friend, colleague, and occasional karaoke sparring partner, Adam Buben, gives quite a good description of it in a paper of his from 2015, the idea that we can simply take online traces of a person or data traces of a person and reanimate them. And of course, this was then the year before actually appeared as fodder for rather disturbing fiction in Charlie Brooker's Black Mirror series in the episode Be Right Back, which of course you can't discuss this without discussing that episode. That happened after some startups had already appeared in this space, offering to do things like, get you to fill in a questionnaire and animate a photo of your face, and then there'll be a digital avatar that people can talk to forever. These companies, as we've already heard, fell over almost immediately, but they did try. Tweets On, I always love mentioning Tweets On. It produced just terrible actual product, but their marketing slogan was, "When your heart stops beating, you'll keep tweeting," which I think is just an absolutely fabulous strapline. And then, of course, in 2018, the Roman Mazurenko bot appears, where the late Russian entrepreneur Roman Mazurenko's text messages, he didn't actually have much of a social media presence, but his text messages were turned into a chat bot, which anyone can now download and chat with for free. So this is, of course, a thing that's being held out to us as, it's going to happen any day now. And a lot of the claims for this are overblown. I know there's people here, obviously, who know an awful lot more about AI than I do, so I'm not going to tell you that. But what's interesting is the way in which sometimes these are presented to us as, well, they're not going to replace the dead, they're just a way of remembering the dead. But other times they're not. So I don't know if you saw this. William Shatner is having quite a year. William Shatner from Star Trek, among other things. He's been into space this year. He's turned 90 this year, but also as part of his 90th birthday celebrations, a company called Storyfile worked with him to set up an avatar that people can interact with centuries from now. And you have to have kind of a Shatner-sized ego to believe that people are going to want to interact with you centuries from now. But look at the way this was presented. The co-founder and CEO of Storyfile, Heather Mayo-Smith, said, generations in the future will be able to have a conversation with him. Not an avatar, not a deep fake, but the real William Shatner, answering their questions about his life and work. Now, that language to a philosopher who works on personal identity gets your ears twitching. That seems, problematic. Why would it be the case that that is actually him? How is that going to be continuous in any kind of identity preserving sort of way? And that is a question that needs to be asked around these bots, because are they going, and particularly given that if people just get used to them and treat them as if they are the dead person, that's going to activate a whole range of ontological and ethical questions. Is the avatar the person themselves, or just a representation of that person? Are they, in Robert Nozick's sense, the closest continua of the person, and therefore have the best claim to actually be the person, given that there's no better continua available? What then happens if those chatbots continue to learn and develop over time? Does that then invalidate any claim to be the person because they're not as they were while they were alive? Or is that just, well, that's what happens to people. They develop over time. And again, I think stewardship models are going to have to address the ontological questions posed by this. And we've already heard some legal discussion of this already so far about how we might manage those remains. But I think there's also a really important question here about the way in which here some of the alterity of a straightforward digital remain, the way in which it's the person, they're just not talking to you because their consciousness is gone, but physically it all kind of looks the way it did. Now that alterity is kind of being replaced. There was already at least one reference to Derrida. Let's go for a second one. Derrida, towards the end of his life, found himself giving a lot of eulogies for his famous friends as they died. And in these eulogies, you can see him wrestling with a range of problems like, is it okay to speak for the dead? We must speak for the dead. It's a moral duty we have to speak for them. And yet it's also a kind of obscenity to speak for the dead, because to speak for them is really to speak over them. But he also talks about the alterity of the dead. Everyone has an alterity just by being, another person, but the dead have this double alterity, that they're also not there, that you can't engage with them. And that is kind of overwritten in the case of these chatbots, or potentially overwritten. They try to create an alterity of the dead. The question is, can they really do that? C.S. Lewis in A Grief Observed said that he was worried that in remembering his wife who had just died, he was overwriting her with his own memories and ideas of her. And he says, what you want is the earthly beloved, even in this life, incessantly triumphs over your mere idea of her. And you want her with all her resistances, all her faults, all her unexpectednesses. You want her to be able to surprise you, to shock you, to do something genuinely new, to have genuine alterity. But that is gone. He says the rough, sharp, cleansing tang of her otherness is gone. And you might remember from that Black Mirror episode, that's how everything comes to grief in that episode, is precisely because that alterity is not there in the bot. It can't genuinely surprise Martha. It can't actually do anything genuinely new. This, I suggest, actually opens up a potential design response here, which is, if we're going to have these bots, make them deliberately glitchy. Make them occasionally express what Heidegger would call unreadiness to hand. That is, make them occasionally remind you that there is, in fact, no actual consciousness behind what you're dealing with. But merely, it's the image of the person, but the thing that mimics consciousness there is actually a simulacrum of that consciousness. And that, I'm conscious of time, but I'll just quickly sort of say here that is, I think, where these digital affordances really show up a split that I think is very fundamental to what people are. Namely what we are as persons, that is, as objects that are available to everyone around us, to which we ascribe a range of various kinds of moral status and political status and social status as well, but what we are each for ourselves, that is, as a first person perspective. And those things do come apart when we talk about death. A now very problematic American film director, so I'm deliberately here using his legal name, not the name everyone knows him by, once famously quipped, "I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve immortality through not dying. I don't want to live on in the hearts of my countrymen. I want to live on in my apartment." What this points to is, as philosophers like Raymond Martin and others have said, what we want in survival, first personally, what we each want for ourselves, is that there be experiences we can anticipate having. I won't go into the technicalities here, but this points to a split between what's sometimes described in the literature as the self and the person. What we are here and now first personally for ourselves, and what we are as persons, as socially or as intersubjective objects that exist in the sort of social life world. And those two things do sort of come apart. And all the things we've looked at so far allow you to persist as a person, albeit in a very degraded form, but they won't allow you to persist as a self. They won't allow you to persist in first person experience. Just very quickly, of course, this is where I think a lot of the mind uploading stuff you get from transhumanists is really problematic, because they talk as if you're going to have first person experience when your data is uploaded into a computer or something like that. So, you know, the TerraSem Foundation, when they talk about your mind clones, say, well, you will upload your mind clone, and then when you die biologically, your mind clone will take over for you, and it will be you, personally, legally, everything. It will continue to present your presence to the world. Now, that could just be the same as a chatbot. That is to say, it's just a replica of you that's been uploaded into a computer, albeit a very powerful one. But even if we want to stipulate that somehow that bot has first personal experience, and we don't really know how to argue that yet, even if that's the case, we don't know how to re-identify first personal experiences. We don't even know what the conditions would be to say that this first person perspective here is the same first person perspective as that first person perspective happening in the computer. So at this point, I think the prospects for digital immortality start to become very bleak. So the early ones, I think, basically do allow you to survive death for others in a way that is not as good as regular survival, but not nothing. It's not nothing, but it's not living on in your apartment. But when we get to mind uploading, I think it really becomes philosophically a much more fraught issue. And at the very least, there's an awful lot more work to be done to tell us how it's possible to survive death in this way, given some of those problems with first person perspective. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick, for an astonishingly rich and lucid presentation at gone midnight, your time. And also for putting the ontological question really front and center, that is lurking behind so many of the other conversations. And I think you really did a lot to clarify what's at stake. I have many questions, I'm sure others do too, but first we are going to hear from Davide Sisto in Turin. At least I assume are you in Turin as we speak?
Yes. Good morning. Un attimo, condividiamo.
Okay. The floor is yours.
Okay. Good morning, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you and to talk about digital immortality. Sorry if my English is not perfect. Here in Italy, we don't usually speak in English, and therefore our ability to speak English is limited, but I will try to talk with you. The title of... Intanto non mettiamo. Check my time. Okay. Presentation. Okay. The title of my talk is From Residual to Digital Ghost, the Presence of the Dead in the On-Life World. Devo mettere la presentazione. Ok. Vabbè. The aim of my short talk is to deal with the topic of digital immortality from the perspective of the social presence of the dead and the grieving process. In particular, I'm going to show the philosophical difference between the concept of residual ghost and the concept of digital ghost. This difference underlines how digital technologies change our secular and social relationship with the dead and the way in which we think about the concept of immortality. These changes generate both opportunities and problems. The starting point of my talk is a fact that has been talked about all over the world and has generated many discussions from the ethical point of view. In 2020, a South Korean woman, Yang In-sung, met through virtual reality technology her daughter Nayeon, who died in 2016 at age 7. This creepy meeting in virtual reality was organized by the South Korean broadcaster MBC within over 1 year. First, Nayeon's features and voice were gradually reconstructed from the photographs and videos that immortalized her during her short life. Second, another child of the same age was subjected to many motion capture sessions to make the avatar's movement realistic. Finally, A virtual paradise was created for the meeting between mother and daughter. A park filled with vegetation and illuminated by a blue sky full of white clouds. Nayeon's avatar was placed in this virtual paradise, and Yang In-sung used a virtual reality headset to immerse herself in this location. The more interesting aspect of the representation of this meeting is the constant overlapping of the physical presence of Yang In-sung, situated in the impersonal recording studio, on her virtual presence in the world artificially created. This overlapping makes possible to observe the contraposition between real and virtual world, between the presence and the absence of Nayeon. After this meeting, Yang In-sung said she lived the dream she wanted to have. Now, how can we analyze this particular meeting in virtual reality with the dead? Many scholars rightly have underlined the problems from the perspective of the grieving process. The prerogative of the funeral rites is to confirm the definitive separation of the dead from the living. The philosopher Jacques Derrida says that the funeral rites ontologize the corpse, identifying the remains and assigning a place to the dead. The funeral is useful both for the dead because it helps to place them once and for all in the realm of the dead, and for the living because it helps them to slowly work through the loss, rebuilding their new reality from the ground up. The meeting between Yang In-sung and Nayeon risked to vanish the funeral's healthy role because of its emotional and psychological consequences. But we can understand this project, as well as any other similar project, also as the contemporary arrival point of the secular social relationship between the world of the dead and the world of the living. There is a particular relationship, there is a particular paradox that defines the status of the dead. Once the funeral rites are observed, the dead become the incarnation of an absent presence. They are absent but present, or present in the absence. The particular relationship between the presence and absence of the dead is bound to our awareness of the empty place that is left by the dead. For example, Jacques Derrida says that the death declares the end of the world in its totality every time a person dies. Habits, customs, rituals, and language that made up the world, the only possible world as far as we were aware, vanish together with the lives of those who have died. So it's normal to look for a way to which we can overcome the distance from the dead. Even when we manage to grieve, we want to avoid the end of the world in its totality, as Derrida says. Now, there is a secular relationship between the absent presence of the dead and the concept of image. What is an image? Plato, in the Sophist, says, well, then stranger, what else are we going to say an image is if it's not what has been made to a true original, another thing of the same sort, another thing of the same sort. The anthropologist Hans Belting says that the true sense of images consists in representing something that becomes absent and that can be present only in the images. In other words, the image is on the one hand a perfect representation of the person that became absent, but it's on the other hand always different from this person because they are no longer physically present. only their representation remains, the image indicates the resemblance without identification. There are many examples about this relationship between the representation and the dead. For example, the so-called funus imaginarium, with which we indicate a special type of funeral rites in ancient Rome. When the body of the deceased was not available, a replacement body made of wax was used. We can think about the important relationship between the dead and photography. We can think about the studies of Roland Barthes and Susan Sontag that indicated a particular form of immortality of the dead on the photograph. Roland Barthes says that photography produces death while trying to preserve life. In an anonymous article from 1896 entitled The Voices of the Dead, the invention of phonograph is hailed as a victory over death. Death has lost some of its sting since we are able to forever retain the voices of the dead. Now, all these kinds of images or representation of the dead appear as a residual ghost, a permanent remnant, or a double that differs from its living twin without becoming someone else. The physical remains of the dead stay forever in the cemetery, and at the same time the dead become a timeless or immortal presence in the signs, images, and sounds that represent them. So those who suffer for the loss of a loved one are aware of their death, but at the same time see and perceive them in the signs, images, and sounds that represent them. These documents preserve their eternal bond, and many people symbolically talk with the spectral presence of the dead in these documents. Residual ghost indicates a kind of immortality that is one-way street. It allows the dead to communicate with the future through what they have produced during their lifetimes, but their communication are always passive. Simon Reynolds says about the recorded music that residual ghost, unlike the intelligent responsive spook that can be communicated with often as a specific message to deliver, the residual ghost is usually unaware of change in its surroundings and continue to play the same scene repeatedly. Digital technologies change everything. The residual ghost becomes the digital ghost. Elias Canetti notes what he believes to be a notable phrase of Schelling's, written in a letter sent by the German philosopher to his friend Georgi in 1811. We must not settle for the generic persistence of our dead. We would rather preserve their personalities in their entirety. Now, digital technologies try to satisfy Schelling. Whereas signs, images, and sounds could substitute or represent the body of the dead in a limited static way, today digital technologies give motion and activity to the eternal psychophysical presence of the dead and endow the digital ghost of the dead with a kind of vitality. Digital ghost indicates a second kind of immortality that runs both ways. It allows the dead to communicate with the future through what they have produced during their lifetimes, and it also offers them the opportunity to continue to learn and evolve. Their communication could be active. To understand the characteristics of digital ghost, we must think about it as follows. The awareness of living in on-life world, namely in a world where there is no longer a difference between the offline and the online dimension, emphasizes the fundamental role of the online data in shaping our personal multi-identity. In particular, now we are able to separate our presence from the physical localization. For example, we can think about the concept of the smartphone as the transportal home, namely as the place where we live, as the Global Smartphone book says. This book is published by an anthropological group of scholars of UCL. When you walk down the street, you can be at the same time on social media, on email, on a website about food, for example. This is the first time in the world in which we are present in many places at the same time. So when that stops our physical movements and our offline life, it doesn't stop our digital multi-presence and our online life. The death of web users doesn't not represent the death of their online multi-identities. This could continue to live and to be updated. Digital ghost of the dead is first the interactive archive of biographical memories of the dead. Social networks are both collective cultural autobiographies, as Kenneth Goldsmith says, and encyclopedias of the dead, if we want to remember the beautiful book by Danilo Kiss written in 1983. Our social networks profiles represent our memories or the digital description of our lives which are stored, shared, and maintained on the internet. These memories and descriptions survive in the online dimensions and seem to live forever due the constant overlapping of the past on the present. This is a typical temporal characteristic of the internet. Digital ghost indicates artificial reproductions of the life of the dead, as in the case of Naion. Virtual reality or artificial intelligence could create an avatar or a hologram of the dead to make the digital multi-identities active and dynamic, ensuring that these take the place of the person who is no longer with us biologically. Ensuring the avatar's total autonomy, meaning that it could be able to learn and update. In this way, the avatar could be able to distance itself in a gradual way from the person whom it initially reproduces. An individual's collection of memories will therefore become another, entirely autonomous person. In conclusion, from the point of view of the bereaved, avatars, grief bots, and holograms of the dead can be understood as an incredible modernization both of the memory of the dead and their social presence. Avatars, grief bots, and holograms are attempts to hang on the bond that death has dissolved. However, we must be clearly aware that we could communicate only with the interactive memories of or digital reproductions of the loved ones, not with them. They have definitely passed away. Therefore, Yang In-sung says she lived the dream she wanted to have because she is aware of the difference between the real Naion and the artificial reproduction of her memories and movements. This kind of immortality concerns a particular form of memory because this memory is not static. We have to underline one last important aspect from the perspective of the deceased. If the digital ghost of the dead could be able to constantly evolve and emancipate themselves from the living who they were, they could be understood as new kinds of human beings. The evolution of digital ghosts of the dead concern only few parts of their multi-identity. It ignores, for example, their unconscious. The emancipation of digital ghosts from the living who they were produces many questions about their relationship with the world of the living and with the world of the living. Could digital immortality indicate the metamorphosis of human beings and not the continuation of their lives? Could the digital ghost of the dead person become a different person who, for example, overcomes the regrets of their previous life? In other words, could we become someone else thanks to digital immortality? And if we will become someone else, how does our digital substitutes relate to those they previously loved? Could this be a way to understand the desire for a virtual paradise where our online data can survive forever? In my opinion, a good philosophy of digital immortality has to separate the perspective of the bereaved from the perspective of the deceased. The first perspective underlines the constant evolution of our many ways of remembering those who passed away. The second perspective underlines instead our possible post-mortem metamorphosis and the fascinating distinction between who we have been and who we might be after our death. Both perspectives produce new fascinating challenges to expanding the boundaries of human beings. Thanks a lot, and I hope my talk is clear.
Thank you, Davide. It was wonderful. It was really interesting. And I love the idea of digital ghosts, really capturing some of the ambiguity that we are wrestling with in thinking about our digital afterlives. And great, so if I can invite all the panelists to turn on their cameras and join the conversation. If Davide, if you could stop sharing your slides. And we have some questions in already. So focusing on the questions of continuity that have been raised, David Burden, who is one of Maggie's co-authors, is in the audience and asks continuity. It may be that the copy experiences full continuity, even if we, the physical entity, don't. Would we perhaps be better or more accurate talking about digital clone immortality? Now, Patrick, I think this is something you are wrestling with in your own position. Please respond.
Yeah, I think it depends what you want out of survival. I mean, the question of, you know, would this thing be me or would it simply be a replica or, you know, famously, there's a whole bunch of thought experiments that you can use here as intuition pumps that sort of push us in different sorts of directions. So, I mean, Parfit famously kind of showed that, you know, yes, it would be me if there's a teleporter or something. Oh, until there's an accident and suddenly there's two of me and then it can't possibly be me, but that can't be what determines whether it's me or not. So it may just be a question of two things actually. One is what you actually want out of survival. That is, if the clone can do all the stuff you care about, then maybe it does do most of what you want out of survival. But again, it's not clear that I can actually look forward to having the experiences that clone does. On the other hand, Mark Johnson sort of suggested that it may well be that our experience of personal identity just is actually protean, is the term he uses. That is to say that it just does actually respond differently to different cultural assumptions about identity and different technological assumptions about identity. And it could be that people who grow up in a world where these technologies are everywhere just do think of them as a form of survival, and they do think you know, one day my body will die and then I'll live on as a in the computer or whatever, or as a bot or whatever. And people may actually just come to have the same kind of what's rather misleadingly called egocentric concern for future experiences, just because they start to project that onto this technology, whether there's a real metaphysical fact about identity there or not.
And of course, they might be wrong. I mean, they might indeed believe they're surviving and turned out much like.
Yeah, but I mean, metaphysics in the end never really matters. You know, that's the thing. It's sort of, I mean, it matters enormously, and yet it also kind of for how people experience these things. I mean, there's a metaphysics that's built into phenomenology. There's a metaphysics of that's me, that's not me. But it may just be that stuff is actually just much more responsive to the messages we're getting from other people. That, you know, a teleporter might look like a suicide machine unless you grew up watching Star Trek, in which case it looks like a form of transport.
I'm glad we got William Shatner back in. I wanted to ask, you know, now we've clearly established that he has an AI which is him. Is it no longer murder to kill the actual biological one? Will it be release from the sufferings of the body? But yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying, Patrick, and you mentioned how Parfit, of course, famously back in the 80s, was telling the story in different ways to reveal how our intuitions could be pulled one way or another. This is so much about narrative, isn't it? And I think what science fiction does so well, on the one hand, in Star Trek, it shows us how easy it is for us to buy into these narratives of continuity. You know, the beamer or whatever it's called, you know, the beam me down Scotty, where someone ripped apart atom by atom and sort of put back together again. Being ripped apart atom by atom clearly isn't the kind of thing we ordinarily think people can survive. And yet the narrative is constructed in a way that makes it seem seamless and portrays it as survival. I mean, might indeed wonder if there's never anyone who could tell the difference. You know, from my point of view, if I would cease to exist as soon as I step in, I can't complain anymore. And then a new clone of me would appear who thinks they're continuous. And so it seems like there is a metaphysical fact to the matter, perhaps even a physical fact to the matter, and yet we could never get to the bottom of it. And then it all becomes about beliefs and narratives. Kasia, do you want to come in on this?
Yes, thank you. So I'm wondering, how do you position your work in terms of transhumanism and post-humanism movements? If or do you refer to those intellectual movements? And if so, why? What are the benefits? And if not, why not? What are the downsides? Patrick touched upon it in your presentations, but I'm asking this because immortality is one of the goals that was expressed explicitly in transhumanism. So I'm trying to understand where we are with our discussion. Are we far away from transhumanism, or are we somewhere in an entirely different place here?
I'm glad you raised that. Thank you, Kasia. And before the panelists jump in, we have a question from Wojciech on transhumanism. And Wojciech says that transhumanism as a movement has been mentioned today, and that transhumanists are frequently patronized or ridiculed or treated as eccentrics. And yet the kind of topics we're discussing are mainstream topics of conversation among transhumanists, some of whom are, of course, extremely highly educated. In fact, I know well Nick Bostrom at Oxford, who was for a long time president of the World Transhumanist Association, and was, of course, a leading thinker on many of these topics. And Wojciech's asking, what do we think is the cause of this derision towards transhumanists? Can they be integrated into discourses like this one that's happening today? So Kasia's question was, how do you three position your work, or think of your in relation to posthumanism and transhumanism, two terms that are often conflated? I think when Catherine Hales was writing about posthumanism 20 years ago, actually she meant transhumanism, but it wasn't so clear then what the distinction was. The movements, I think, have diversified greatly since then. Do you position your work vis-a-vis those two movements? And in as much as transhumanists are ridiculed or excluded, does anyone have a view on why? Patrick, I think you're the only one who's mentioned transhumanism explicitly. So would you like to kick off?
Well, only in passing. And I mean, I don't know that most of what I'm talking about does fit within a transhumanist frame, because it's not really deliberate, right? Most of the forms of survival that we're talking about that emerge here aren't necessarily being like, you know, digital remain stuff is more or less just an accidental byproduct of the sort of digital platforms we've established. Things like chatbots and so on, yeah, is pushing in that direction, but it is actually noticeable that apart from the Star Trek example I gave, a lot of the people working in that space are really careful to say, I'm not trying to replace the dead. I'm not trying to allow them to survive. It's just a form of remembering them or engaging with them. So there's an interesting kind of disconnect there. The transhumanists, I think, helpfully do kind of bite that bullet. Why they are ridiculed, I don't know. Some of the stuff, as I say, some of the Terrasem stuff, I think does seem to lack a certain kind of philosophical rigor, specifically around personal identity, but that doesn't mean the rest of it lacks that kind of rigor necessarily. I will say too, that I think a lot of the discussions in philosophy about whether immortality would be desirable do actually take transhumanism as a kind of a springboard, not necessarily engaging so much with the direct ideas of transhumanism as saying, okay, if these guys are right, if they can do this, what then follows for that in terms of some of the axiological claims we want to make. Mm. So I think it does get taken seriously in that respect, at least, but whether that's, you know, whether that's fully taking something seriously, I'm not entirely sure.
Well, I think you're right to pull apart these different aspects. And I would suggest, before I can answer your question, if there's perhaps one core reason, it's because part of the work done by people who identify as transhumanists, they would see as contributing to various academic discourses. And when they do so, it's taken seriously. And there's no denying Bostrom's taken seriously. And, you know, but that's not all that they do. And at the same time, transhumanism is a utopian movement. You know, it's not just contributing to certain arguments. It's also saying, you know, we dream of a world, of a future that can be like this. And I think that's moving to a space where people with different visions are going to critique that, or people are going to, you know, think of it as wishful thinking, and so on. And that's an interesting space for a philosophical movement to be in, because the worry about sort of wishful thinking, if you're portraying a vision of a future world you want, is always going to be present when in the arguments, I think, which I'm not saying it is influencing the arguments only, but that worry is always going to be there. But there's a kind of ideological load shaping the arguments. Maggie, Davide, any views on transhumanism and its relationship to
I'm no expert. I mean, but the transhumanists that I think have got a lot of media attention have not necessarily been helpful to the movement. So I mean, Patrick's already mentioned the Terrasem movement. I think also transhumanists like Stellark, who are using art or growing ears on their forearm or whatever you happen to be doing, or even our then Pro-Vice Chancellor, who chipped himself so he could operate his heating and fridge some 20 years ago. You know, those kinds of things get media attention, which I'm not sure is helpful to the transhumanist or post-humanist, well, probably transhumanist mainly, movement. And so I think that sets up a media sense of the ridiculous, which is probably philosophically not entirely fair. I wouldn't have said the work that David Burden and I have been doing would fit into, well, I suppose it's on the edge of transhumanism because it's chatbots. But I mean, when we launched our book at Trinity College a few years ago, you know, David was asked, you know, how long before you could make one of these sentient? And I think it's a very difficult question. And then we thought about 40 years, but then you're still back to the philosophical question that we've been dealing with is, what is sentience anyway? And who decides?
Yes, indeed. David, you're on mute.
In my opinion, the transhumanist movement is very interesting from the literary point of view, because it's very interesting the obsession, for example, about the role of our body related to our life. And this aspect is in my opinion, very, very unrealistic, because it's very difficult to think about the human being without the psychophysical unity. And the role of body is a role that defines what we are. And I don't think that transhumanists, that the way with transhumanism think about our mortality is real. Like, I don't know.
Yes, thank you. And I mean, I too have argued that, and I'm not the only one, that transhuman stories about routes to immortality are retellings of old myths and ways of thinking about how we can transcend the body, and are more rooted in those myths than they are in sort of scientific and philosophical fact. Philosophical fact, is that a thing? Probably not. We've got a question from Nana. Thank you for these amazing talks. Nana's a student at Cambridge. I wonder, how does the self-person distinction relate back to the idea of ownership of one's person or digital remains or body? To some extent, the legal language of ownership seems a bit reductive, especially when relating to the experience of the self. So how does this play into the prospects for technologies of immortality? And here again, we see this sort of the ontological, shifting ontological sands under our legal concepts. Could it be argued, she continues, that personhood is more compatible with the idea of digital remains, whereas the self will, at least for now, necessarily end with the death of the physical body? So Patrick, I think again, we must start with you, as you brought in this distinction between self and person.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. With the very slight complication that it doesn't actually matter for this discussion, but that I think selves are necessarily present tense. And so there's a question about saying when it will end is kind of problematic. But yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. So yes, that's
Okay.
a nice simple one.
Very good. Anyone else want to come in on that? So if not, then Ian Brewer asks, is there any data to demonstrate the appetite for a digital avatar? Just as earlier we were looking at appetite to preserve one's data for posterity and so on. So it's a very good question. Are we speculating about something no one's interested in? I mean, there's certainly anecdotal evidence that people are very interested in this. There are companies starting. Of course, the Transhumanist Movement is itself evidence that people are interested in this. But is anyone aware of any data on whether people want to live on as a digital avatar? Maggie, you've been talking to real humans.
Yeah, real humans. Yeah, it's only a small scale study, sort of 16 to 20 people, the in-depth interviews with 16 people, and then follow-up discussions, going back to your question about the digital and the spiritual. About 5 or 6 of them thought they might choose to have an avatar. A lot of them just thought it was a daft idea, and why would you want to? And there were some really interesting ethical questions about, well, if I did make one and my son wanted it and my husband didn't, and my grandchildren thought it was fantastic, who would have the decisions about whether to shut me down or not? So I think for me, those were the more interesting questions than about whether people would want one. It was about the actual remains and the choices around the avatar.
Mm.
And just if I may, I recently came across some researches that were conducted in United States and in Great Britain, and people were asked how they view immortality and if they would like to consider immortality for themselves. And the majority of respondents said that they are not interested in it at all. It made me thought that maybe we are trying to provide a remedy for death, or for fear of death, that seems to be equally terrifying or maybe undesirable at all.
Hmm. Yes, no, I like the idea that, of course, people could have wildly different views, the various stakeholders, on whether it's desirable. And we've talked about Be Right Back, but there's another Black Mirror episode, I think it's called White Christmas, is where a digital clone of someone is created in order to serve as their kind of PA stroke, executive assistant. And this digital clone, which is conscious, at first refuses. So it's tortured by effectively having its sort of own experienced time accelerated. So it experiences like 20 years of nothing, just being in a blank white room, until it's so desperate to do anything that it becomes willing to then act as an sort of personal assistant to the real human. So there's no question that this is survival as such. It's clearly a separate being, but that's an instance of this digital avatar not wanting to exist, indeed. And again, this is something that I think has been really richly explored in fiction, not just that episode.
Yeah, things like The Afterwife, I think, very poignant on
that. Great. We have a question from Jay, which is going back again to this questions of personal identity theory. Does a certain amount of similarity have to obtain between the alive person and their digital assets post-mortem in order for there to be survival? To which the answer is yes, I think, on any theory of personal identity. Secondly, people change a lot over their lifetimes, and we accept that this does not invalidate survival. Is there a similar possibility for a person to change digitally post-mortem and survive as the same person they were in life? Now, of course, all theories of personal identity do permit change, with the possible exception, I guess, of soul-based theories, where you might think a soul remains in some sense the same, but that's not very clear. But all theories are able to accommodate that in some way. But Patrick, I'm interested in your views, but yours too, Davide, because you introduced this very interesting concept of metamorphosis, which I thought was very apt. I mean, as far as I'm aware, and please feel free to correct me, anyone, if you know better, scientists don't know whether, say, butterflies have any continuity of consciousness with caterpillars. I think there has been some evidence that they do, and yet it's very hard to understand how that could be. So the metamorphosis is clearly a very, very radical transformation that might not even preserve what, as Patrick said, we value in survival, the continuity of consciousness, but also it might, but maybe in some very attenuated and reduced or thin way, like the Buddhist idea of the soul, for example. It's sort of a very thin conception of the self that passes from one to the other. How do we make sense of that? What is enough continuity? Patrick first, as our resident personal identity theorist, and then Davide, I'd be interested to hear your views, and of course Maggie, if you want to come in.
Yeah, the question about whether these avatars can change over time. I mean, I think Jay's absolutely right. That doesn't seem to invalidate the idea of survival, and indeed, if it may be one of the reasons why they may not be convincing is if they don't change. But on the other hand, as I say, one of the things that seems to be missing from bots is that genuine alterity, the capacity to surprise us, because they simply are a whole bunch of information about us and an algorithm, right? So it's basically just, I mean, I'm sure there's a more complicated or accurate description that can be given, but nonetheless, the idea is, in principle, everything's already there, right? That everything they're ever going to do, in principle, is already implicitly in there already. So there's kind of a Laplace's demon sort of issue that arises here, that even if the bot suddenly has a midlife crisis and changes religion and whatever else, what we could then say is, well, that was implicit in the person anyway. That's what they were going to do, because we know provided the algorithm is right. But if that's the case, then that invalidates a lot of that rather optimistic stuff I said about alterity, because it may just be that, in fact, the alterity is not really there anyway. If hard determinism is true, then, in fact, we never actually do anything that's, surprising is only ever an epistemic qualification. We never actually do anything genuinely free or spontaneous. And, maybe bots can give a simulacrum of spontaneity that's perfectly accurate.
And what's interesting,
spontaneous change over time.
And of course, here we are considering the recreation of a thing digitally. Now, presumably there are many, many billions of parameters that can be tweaked. So getting the right amount of alterity or spontaneity is presumably going to be very tricky. And if we get too little, as we've talked about, then the entity will be too passive, too static, uninteresting. But if we get too much, of course, then we get into the realm of metamorphosis. Then we have an entity about which we might not care, whose values we don't share, for example. And I think here we get into kind of argument Bernard Williams made also some 40 years ago now about why immortality would necessarily be bad. Because inevitably we would change so much, we would at some point, this isn't quite what he said, but something like we would change so much, we would become the kind of thing that we sort of don't like or don't care about or have no reason to identify with. But Davide, please say more about your ideas of metamorphosis, how they answer these questions.
But I think that when we speak about digital immortality, is fundamental separate the perspective of bereaved from the perspective of the deceased. From the perspective of the deceased, I think that the concept of metamorphosis is related to the concept of emancipation, independence, evolution, because the concept of metamorphosis is in relationship with the multi-identity of that defines what we are. The avatar, for example, reproduce a little part of the multi-identity what we are, and the concept of metamorphosis about the avatars indicates, from my point of view, that the transformation of the singular part in another, maybe another person, because this singular part represents only the little part of the person that dies. And for example, I think upload series, Amazon, from famous Amazon series TV. The protagonist, Nathan, the protagonist of Upload, feels new emotions, produces new thoughts, and falls in love with another woman. There is a radical transformation of his person, because his experience in this virtual paradise in which he is uploaded determines a radical transformation, and determines on particular situation, particular transformation of a part of his identity. According to me, the concept of metamorphosis is very, very related to this character of multi-identity that represent a human being. And when we try to maintain the person who died, and we hope to continue to interact with him, in reality we risk to to communicate with another person.
That's so interesting, Anna. I mean, I love the language of metamorphosis, but it does convey something very organic, whereas what we could be talking about is something very programmable, you know, where we control the parameters. This is a digital entity, you know, and you know, we might accidentally or on purpose change the parameters so that suddenly this avatar is quite different. And then, of course, if we regard it as another person, do we have the right to turn it back? We have another question on personal identity regarding the psychological theory of personal identity from Parfit. Hugh McIntyre asks, taking a Parfitian embodied person, then given sufficient digital psychological continuity, the addition of sufficient embodiment would presumably rescue the desired continuity of an experientially grounded self? Question mark. Patrick.
I think Parfit would say it does if it's gradual. I think if we're just, it's the thought experiment. If I take each brain cell out one by one and replace it with a silicon one, eventually I've got a fully silicon brain, but psychological continuity is maintained. So yeah, I mean, I think for Parfit that would work. But I mean, for Parfit, what those thought experiments show is precisely that there is no deep fact about selfhood anyway. There's just facts about psychological and physical continuity. How that then maps onto the idea of the first person self that I experience myself as being right now, wondering, is that going to be me tomorrow after the surgery in which I'm going to be, have, bits of me gradually replaced with a computer or whatever. That I think is less clear, but that's because it is subtly changing the topic to ask that.
I've always been very skeptical of those Parfitian arguments where you replace one cell or molecule or whatever at a time. On the basis of they just seem to be Sorites paradoxes. I mean, it's actually in nature not at all inconceivable that if you replace bit by bit, his arguments are, if you replace so gradually, how could there possibly be one cell or one atom or whatever that makes the difference and switches it from one person to the other or from life to death? But of course, that's exactly how life works. If you start removing my brain cells, there will come a point where I die, even though it seems absurd that I have billions of neurons. So I've always been surprised there's been more pushback against those arguments, but an awful lot of philosophers do find them very plausible. We have another question from Ian Brewer, a different tack and very interesting one. So a few of our speakers have emphasized the distinction between the first person point of view, the question of survival and prudential concern or egoistic concern, versus the point of view of others. And Ian asks, he says, we've done work with positive feedback about using an avatar of the person to help one get over the grieving process. So here we're talking about the people left behind. It's well proven people with terminal illness are encouraged to make videos, record voice, etc. by Cancer Trust, as it has helped with the grieving process after the person has gone. So from the sort of third person point of view, from the point of view of those left behind, do these avatars have a function? Davide, it looks like we should be able to hear you, but we can't. You're not muted.
I don't hear. I don't hear you.
Can you hear me now? We can hear you now.
Non sento più.
Can you hear us now? Okay, well, while you're looking into that, Maggie, any thought?
I don't know Ian's work. I'd love to read his work on this because I'm not aware of it. I mean, the work that we did was with students, and ours was much more about would they trust an avatar more than they would they reveal more to an avatar than they would to an online questionnaire? And the men said they wouldn't, and the women said possibly, and actually the men did reveal more than the women. So that was, again, a small-scale study, but interesting about people's perceptions of what who they will reveal to and what they will reveal and how much. I think the other thing, going back to the whole business, which is also Davide's stuff, is about the whole business of what happens later and about perceptions of that and about progression and development. And I think there is a sense in some faiths that once you die, there is a possibility of developing yourself before whatever happens next, the final trumpet or whatever. So that's just a small aside. Well, Davide sorts himself out. But yeah, so I would like to see Ian's work, please, if that's possible. Yes.
So Ian, if you're still with us, please put a link into the chat. That does sound really interesting. And thank you for your question. We have a nice comment from David Burden. Informal votes I've taken, he says, during university talks have shown a real bathtub curve. So this was whether you, relating back to whether you'd want to live on as a digital avatar, either very much for or very much against. But interestingly, when asked if people would like their nearest and dearest to exist as a digital immortal, there was an overwhelming negative response. So this also relates to this question of perhaps they can serve a function in helping with the grieving process, but will they help people to move on? Do we want all of our loved ones, spouses of various kinds, lingering digitally? Davide,
just on that, I was
yes.
just going to say, Alexis Elder has a really great paper on the potential use of chatbots in Confucian mourning practices, and trying to argue there is a sort of a closure type model that you can actually use here. And Davide has already mentioned that Korean TV show with Nae on the 8-year-old girl who died. And that too is, I mean, Elaine Caskett's written a little bit about this, that really what you're seeing there is almost like a funeral. You're seeing like there are kind of funerary elements to it. And it is very much a kind of a transformation, letting go sort of experience rather than an ongoing presence thing. So, I mean, there is certainly potential for those.
I think the difficulty though, Patrick, with that is the kind of assumption that closure and moving on is a thing. Whereas most of the research, as we know, on mourning and grief is actually about continuing bonds now. So that I still think there's quite a liminal space around how we manage the people who think there should be closure and moving on, and those who talk about continuing bonds.
Really interesting. There is a question in the chat for Davide, but we've lost him. He's having trouble hearing us, and we're out of time anyway. So please, everyone, join me in thanking Maggie and Patrick and Davide in his absence for really fantastic, stimulating talks and great discussion. So first round of applause for them. Virtual round of applause is not quite the same, I know, but we can hear it echoing around the world. We're going to have a half-hour break now before our final panel, which is on design for digital immortality. That is in half an hour, so 3 p.m. UK time. And for that, I will be handing over to my colleague, Katarzyna. Thanks again to all our participants for joining and for your questions. And of course, thanks most of all to our 3 great panelists. See you in half an hour.